Welcome everyone. Looking forward to learning with all of you over the next couple of hours. I think some of you have been in Shiur with me for the last month, but some of you I haven't learned with. So looking forward again. The topic, we'll just say a couple words about the topic, is the end of humility. And I think when I say the end, I mean that in three different ways. So first of all, we're jumping to the end of the Perek. It's really going to be focused on the last three lines essentially of our Perek and of Maseches Sota overall. And number one, you can say that you did the whole Perek because you started at the beginning and you got to the end. Although hopefully you'll fill in the middle at some point. And in that sense, it's the end, and the end of our Perek talks about this issue of humility. But when I talk about the end of humility, there's still two different factors here. One is we're going to be talking about the historical end of humility that our Mishnah and our Gemara talk about, how after Rabbi, around the year 200 or so, when Rabbi passed away, the Mishnah and Gemara say and the Mishnah presumably not written by Rabbi himself because it refers to his passing, but the Mishnah says that humility ended. So we're going to try to figure out exactly what that means, and the Gemara objects to it, but we're also going to figure out what the goal, what the meaning, what the significance of humility is, which is not a simple thing. There's several different views, and as we'll see, different interpretations of this Gemara will point to different meanings as to what the ultimate goal or what it means to have humility, and that end of humility as well. So that's our plan. Most of our sources are going to be on our Gemara, on that passage at the end. It should all be on the handout. So first the Mishnah, the Gemara, a bunch of commentaries on that passage in Gemara, and then at the end of the handout there's reference to a few different cases, a few different other sources that will help us explicate that, some of which are actually timely, are tied to the Churban, the destruction of the Mikdash, and of course we find ourselves in the 9 days right now. The handout has, the first 3 pages are the sources in their primary form, and then there's translations of the Hebrew sources following that. So up to you whether what makes the most sense to work with, but that's how the handout is structured. We're going to have about an hour of Seder now, where I think Michael's going to break you up into Charusas more or less at random. And the goal is to get through what you can on the source sheet over the next hour. And then we'll have about an hour, maybe a drop less, of Shiur going through the sources, trying to develop some of these ideas together prior to the closing. So that's the plan. I'll be available for the next hour if you want, if any Charusa wants to summon me or whatever it's called using the Zoom feature. I'm happy to pop in if I can be helpful. But with that said, good luck on the learning over the next hour, and let's all think about humility and its end together. Okay, so let's jump in. We mentioned before that when we talk about the end of humility, we're talking about the end of our Perek. We're talking about the historical end of humility, as the Mishnah and Gemara put it, and we're also talking about what exactly the goal of humility is, what exactly it means to be humble, and how that manifests itself. So let's start by going through the relevant Mishnah and Gemara on Daf Mem Tes at the end of our Perek, and we'll go from there. We'll try to understand what's going on. I guess I'm not going to call on people. I didn't warn you in advance that you'd be cold called or anything. So I'll read through the Mishnah myself, but please everyone follow along inside if you can. So the Mishnah starts, Bepumus shel Aspasianus, Gazral Atros Chasanim Va'al Ha'erus. In the polemos, in the war or the polemic, the Greek word can mean either, and just like in English, right? A war or a polemic comes from this word pulmus. So in the war and ensuing polemic of Vespasian, the Roman general and emperor, following his attacks on Jerusalem, they made a gzera. They made a decree not to wear various crowns for a groom and about certain celebrations of engagement. And this is part of a list that we're going to see part of that as various degrees of destruction of Jerusalem and the temple took place in the end of Bayesheni, there were various decrees to sort of move away from happiness, and we'll also see to move away from Greek culture in a certain way. So that's the next line. But Pulmo shel Titus, in the polemic following the war of Titus, also general and emperor, Gazral Atros Kalos, they made exer against crowns of brides at weddings. Vishalo Yelamed Adam Espino Yavanis, and that a person shouldn't teach his child Greek. You shouldn't teach Greek, or maybe Greek language, or maybe Greek philosophy. We'll see that in a bit. And the Mishnah goes on with a couple of more xeros, a couple of more decrees that they made in reaction, in response to Roman destructions of Yerushalayim and the Mikdash. And then the Mishnah transitions to a different, or maybe not so different point. Misha Mace, Rabbi Meir, Batlu, Moshe Mishalim. When Rabbi Meir died, that was the end. That was the last of those who made good parables. Misha Mace ben Azai, Batlu Ashakdanim. When Ben Azai died, those who were diligent ceased. Misha Mace ben Zoma, Batlu Darshanim. When Ben Zoma died, the exegetes were stopped. Misha Mace Rabbi Akiva, Batal Kavod Torah. The honor of Torah stopped when Rabbi Akiva passed away. It's a process of devolution. As all of these Torah sages passed away, they were the last of their kind, the last who represented these values, and in their absence, they really were missing. People of action stopped at the time of Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa. Yossi Katanta Pasku Chasidim, piety, the pious people stopped after the time of Yossi the small, and he was the smallest of all the Chasidim, of all the pious, and yet after his time, still, there was still a tangible loss of piety. The splendor, the glory of wisdom was lost when Yochanan ben Zakkai died. The honor of Torah passed after Gamliel Zaken's passing. And purity and asceticism stopped as well. Mishames Rabbi Yishmael ben Pavi, Batla Ziv HaKahuna, the glory of priesthood stopped at the time of Rabbi Yishmael ben Pavi. And now, the most important line for us, Mishames Rebbe, Bata Anava Viraschet. When Rabbi Huda Anasi, the editor of the Mishnah, died, that was the end of humility and fear of sin. Now, obviously, you'll say, well, how could Rabbi have written this? He's the author of the Mishnah, he put it in the line after he died. So this is one of the proofs, for those interested in these questions, one of these proofs that not every line in the Mishnah was from Rebbe. It seems pretty clear that someone after Rebbe included lines like this, or even included some lines formulating Rebbe's opinion in the third person, right? Rabbi Huda Hanasi said this, that's presumably someone else. Rabbi Huda Hanasi died, and the result was X, presumably was not written by him. Fine, so there are two parts to this Mishnah. The first part, as was said, was the destruction of Yerushalayim and the Mikdash and various decrees that were made in response to sort of limit both happiness, to limit celebration at weddings, and to limit Greek, to limit the influence of Greek language and or culture. And then the second half is almost in parallel. As the temple is destroyed, and there's a loss of various things. Also, as these rabbis pass, there's a loss of certain values along the way. Of course, different. There's no Xera, and it wasn't, it's expected, obviously, that rabbis die and that things change over time. But still, there's two parallel losses. One loss corresponding to the temple, to the Mikdash, and one loss corresponding to great rabbis who die. Just jumping ahead to source number 2, to our Gemara, to the Gemara that talks about it, it gives a little bit of the background of the story about why Shelo Yelamed Espino Yavanis, why not to teach Greek? Why was that an appropriate response to Titus or to other Greco-Roman attacks? So the history shifts a bit earlier. The Gemara says, when the different Hasmonean houses fought one another, which seems to be a bit earlier than Titus, but either way, it's connected. Two different generals from the Hasmonean kingdom were on two sides of the walls of Jerusalem, right? Hyrcanus was besieging Aristobulus. Despite the siege, the whole idea of a siege is to not provide any resources for inside, to sort of starve out the people inside. And despite the siege, since both sides were pro-temple, right? They both were Hashmonaim, Hasmoneans. They would, every day they'd send over money on the one hand, and then they'd send over sheep to bring the carbon tamid, to bring the daily sacrifice in the temple. There was one elder there who knew the wisdom of Greek, or maybe the wisdom of the Greek language. There's a whole dispute about this. We're not going to get into it now. He sort of whispered, he hinted to them something in Greek. He said, as long as the people inside are bringing the sacrifices, they're dealing with the service in the temple, you're not going to win the war. It's so powerful. This idea of continuing the temple service is so powerful that it's not like we're fighting the war, fight the war as if there's no tamid, and bring the tamid as if there's no war, or whatever Churchill would say in context. That doesn't work. You need to cancel the tamid because of the war. The two are related. As long as they have that national energy surrounding and pride surrounding the carbon tamid, you won't win. And lamachar shushlahem dinar and bekupa v'helulahem chazir. The next day, instead of sending over the sheep in return for the money, they sent over a pig. Obviously, you're not going to bring a pig as a carbon. In remarkable symbolism, the pig on its way up sticks its hoof in the wall and creates this earthquake. The whole Eretz Yisrael shook for 400 parsa. They said at that time, cursed is one who raises pigs. Okay, that seems to be a pretty well followed over the generations. It's not so traditional to raise pigs, but also cursed be one who teaches his child Greek. And again, there's a whole discussion: is this Greek language, and because it happened to be used in the story, it's the problem, or is it somehow the Greek philosophy that was the idea behind this cessation of the sacrifice? But whatever it is, there's an end of sacrifices, an end of karbanos, and the response is to cut off the Jewish people from Greek culture. That's the rabbinic response. So hold that in the back of your heads for now, and let's now turn to analyze our line. Remember, the Mishnah said, "Mishames Rebbe batla nava viras." When Rebbe died, that was the end. That was the ceasing of both humility and fear of sin. So the Gemara is going to object to that. Mishames Rebbe batla nava viras. Amar le Rav Yosef latana. So this Mishnah, as with all Mishnahs, is recited by a Tana. Tana can mean two things. It can either mean a rabbi of the Tannaitic period, the first 2 centuries CE, or a Tana can be a person reciting the Mishnah later on. So in this case, it's the latter. Someone was reciting this Mishnah, and Rav Yosef was sitting in front of him and said, "Oh, actually, I have a correction, right? Lo tisni anava tiika ana." When you're reciting this Mishnah, skip the last line. That when Rebbe died, there's no more humility. That's not true. So it's incorrect. So don't teach that line in the Mishnah. Because the ikana, there's me. I, Rav Yosef, am humble. So what do you mean that Rebbe was the last of the humble people? I myself am humble, so that's incorrect. Don't teach that line. Amar le Rav Nachman latana, and similarly, Rav Nachman also said to this reciter or a different reciter, Lo tisni yiraschet, take out that line, take out the word fear of sin, that after Rebbe there were no more people who feared sin. The ikana, I fear sin, so it's incorrect that Rebbe was the last of these, that ceased since his passing. I fear sin, so therefore that should be included. Perek Egla Arufa. So again, we at least can read that line that we finished, even though I don't think any of the shiurim got to the end, but maybe there's still, maybe that's a future project. So what's very unusual about this last line in the Gemara? I guess I can only see most of you on screen, but yeah, raise your hand if you can, or chat to Veer.
Well, on its face, it's very unusual because they're claiming to be humble, and that's not an act of humility. But in our chavrusa, we thought of kind of like a different reading that we didn't see in the Mefarshim.
Well, let's start with the question. We'll get to some answers, and people have a chance to suggest their own in a bit, right? But it's a question that jumps out at you, right, Tavir? That saying that you're humble, saying, oh, no one's humble anymore. What do you mean I'm humble? I'm so humble. There's obviously something ironic about that, and maybe self-undermining, right? To say that you yourself are humble, probably humble people don't go around calling themselves humble. And yet that's how Rashi reads the Gemara, right? Without any note or any indication that something is odd. He says, Di'ika ana, shani anvesan, I'm humble. So I'm humble, so therefore, you can't be, don't say that no more humble people exist. There's me, and there's no irony there. So it is possible, of course, that the nature of irony and humor was different in the time of Chazal. It's hard to know that for sure. But certainly, many, many, many people reading the Gemara, traditional commentaries have noted this problem, and there's a host of solutions. I think there's 6 possible solutions on our handout. I think Dvir has another one, it sounds like. But let's open it up. What do people want to suggest to point to some of the responses? And I think we'll see some of the responses reread the Gemara in one way or another, and some of the responses redefine humility. Right? Those are sort of the 2 tracks to get around this self-undermining, ironic point. So, does someone want to throw out, suggest one of the approaches that rereads the Gemara? That's always easier, right? You have a source that seems problematic. Well, you didn't read it right. If you read it properly, there's no problem. Well, what are some rereadings of our Gemara compared to how we just read it? Jessica.
So Rashi says, "Oh, their humility was different."
Sorry, which text? Well, which?
Rashi says, "Shane and Vatan."
Okay, interesting.
Well, we also had a conversation about whether it's Sha'ani and Vatan or whether it's Shani.
Yeah, I think you have to read it She'ani here. I think you have to read it She'ani because Rashi's paraphrasing that line, right? So Anna is the She'ani, and I think you have to, meaning if Rashi wanted to say this is a different form of humility, he might have to spell that out a bit more. But definitely an interesting reading, and certainly some of the approaches will say that this is a different form or there is a different type of humility. So so other suggestions. What are some ways of rereading the Gemara? Okay, Miriam.
That Ana is a person. Or we in fact first translated it as Ana, as in like Ana Hashem Hoshiana. So maybe like there is prayer, there is humility in prayer, could be another way of saying it.
Okay, great. So to reread the word Ana, right? Rashi says Ana means She'ani, right? Ana means me, and that seems to be what it means. But there is a possibility of rereading Ana. I think, Miriam, you gave 2 possibilities. Either it's a different person, or maybe it's I as I relate to God, almost in God's hands, and sort of removing the personhood to some degree. So I didn't see that in the sources, but it could very well be. But in terms of the first answer, the say Ana as a person, do you recall who suggests that answer?
Divrei Eliyahu, based on the Gra.
Yeah, Divrei Eliyahu writes students' notes on what the Gra said. So let's read that together. Source number 8. It's really a fascinating, maybe the most interesting rereading, the most surprising. So he quotes the Gemara, Mishames, Rabbi Batla, Nava B'Yarschet, and I'm sorry about the quality of this, but I don't think it exists in digital form. So it's a screenshot of an old scan on Hebrew books. Amrli Rav Yosef Latana Lotisne Anava Di'ika Ana, and that's the Gemara. And he asks, L'chora kasha, halozeh gufa havi gaiva, be'im sheyomer adam shehu anav. Isn't it itself pride or being not so humble to say that you're humble? V'yesh lomar dehine nimtza v'Yerushalmi amora acher hanikra b'shem Ana. But here's the thing: there's a Yerushalmi that there is this Amora whose name is Ana. Zesh Amar Rav Yosef lo tisne anava de batla diika Amora acher Ana v'hu Ana v'ad l'ma'od. Right. So read that into the Gemara. Rabbi Yosef says, don't say that Rebbe was the last of the humble people, because there's this fellow I know. His name is Ana. He happens to be exceedingly humble, and therefore Rebbe wasn't the last one. Totally solves the problem, right? He's not talking about himself. Very, very simple. The only problem is, well, first of all, Ana usually means I. That's the first problem. But the other problem is, even if you accept that Ana might be a name, people struggle to find where this Ana is in the Yerushalmi. So some people say, well, maybe it's a different word that has a slightly different text, and maybe the Gra had a different version of the Yerushalmi somewhere and had Ana. But this seems a little bit of a stretch, both just in itself and especially in light of the fact that the Yerushalmi our text of the Yerushalmi at least doesn't have Ana anywhere. But that certainly is one way out. One way of rereading the Gemara. Ana doesn't mean me. It means some fellow named Ana. Okay, that's one. We're going to get a couple more. Zoe, do you have is that a hand raised? Yeah.
That's a hand, yeah. So the Sfat Emet suggests that the reason Rav Yosef is able to say this is that we have other examples of him being humble. So he left the position of Nazi to Rabbi, even though he was the one whose skills were more valued. So if you can show through your actions that you have been humble, then you can call yourself humble, maybe.
Okay, so the Sfas Emes actually makes two separate points. So one of them, Zoe, I think, is in the direction you were going, which is he points out that the Gemara in Horios Yudalit says that Rabbi and Rav Yosef were both candidates for Nasi, for being sort of the head of the Sanhedrin or the head of the Jewish community, and Rabbi gave it up. Sorry, Rav Yosef gave it up to Rabbi, so that indicates humility. I think that's his proof for how we know that Rav Yosef is humble. But I think that's still, that doesn't necessarily solve the problem, because just because we know Rav Yosef was humble doesn't mean that Rav Yosef can, that doesn't mean it would be humble for Rav Yosef to get up and say, look at me, I'm humble. So there's an extra piece that he builds in. He quotes, he mentions that, he says, Eina perush, batla anava viraschet ligamre. He says, when it says there's no more humility, it doesn't mean that there's no humility at all. We're not talking about individual people, like the last human who ever was humble. We don't mean that. We mean, we mean in different generations, we moved from a humble generation at the time of Rabbi to now our generations are no longer humble. But it's not talking about individuals, right? Again, it doesn't say Rabbi was the last humble person. It says Misha Mace Rabbi. When Rabbi died, humility ended. It's not talking about one person. It's talking about the generation. So Rebbe's generation was the last generation of humility. Rav Yosef says, I object. I object. Our generation is a generation of humility. How so? De'ika anna, there's me. Okay, how does that solve the problem? So he goes on and explains that mi de'ika, he says, me rov ha'olam, lafuge yichim shador, shemi kodem, hayam moshel anav vir, etc. Fine. He says, Rav Yosef and Rabba were both very humble people. And we know that, as Zoe said, we know that because he even gave up, Rav Yosef gave his position. So they said, mi de'ika anna. What does it mean there's me? Al karchach nimtza came birova olam. They were so humble, Rav Yosef said, look, if I'm no better than the next guy, if I'm humble, probably everyone else is humble. So that's what de'ika anna means. It means not that I'm unusually humble, I'm humble like anyone else. So, and of course, that's not true because Rav Yosef was much more humble than other people, but precisely because he was so humble, he didn't realize how unrepresentative he was of his generation. So he said, no more humility. That's not true. There is humility because look, I'm the average and I'm humble, so probably everyone else is humble. Just finish the piece. And by the way, that means Rabbi Yosef is wrong, right? Because he's not representative. He's so humble that he thinks that the generation is humble, and that's not true. So that's another rereading. The rereading is, we're not talking about the individual, we're talking about the generation. Rav Yosef mistakenly thought that he's representative of his generation and that they're all humble, but actually it's not true. He himself is humble, but precisely because he's humble, he didn't realize how special he was. It's like a little bit inception there, a little bit like a mind-bending shot there, but very interesting piece of the Sfas Emes, building on these 2 points. Number one, we know Rav Yosef is humble, and number two, that humility actually, sort of blocked his ability to understand the generation, which is what this teaching is actually about. Rami.
That really fits with I don't remember which commentator said that he acted like one of his students.
Okay.
He considered himself like one of his students almost.
Okay, yeah, I guess that would also be a sign of humility. Rami, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I mean, isn't it a little bit of a contradiction to, like, I feel like humility would normally imply you have sort of an extra awareness of other people and sort of a lessened awareness of yourself. So wouldn't it sort of be like, how could you be humble if you're not even aware that everyone else is not humble? Like, that sort of seems like a contradiction.
That's interesting, right? So I guess what the Sfas Emes could say is, despite, maybe humility is sometimes hard to see. And it's easy to see your own humility or lack thereof. It's harder to see other people's humility because, and maybe you always give them the benefit of the doubt. And since if he assumes he's nothing special, then everyone else too. But yeah, it's an interesting point that the presumption here is not just that he thought he was humble, but also that he was a little clueless about everyone else, right? It's a fair critique of the Sfas Emes here. One of the weaknesses, I think. Yeah. Okay, Dvir.
So what we said in our Charusa was like Anav represents Moshe and Moshe's project of finishing, putting together the Torah. And so what the sentence is really saying is a debate about Rabbi Yehuda Nasi represents, is that the end of Moshe's project? Is the end of Moshe's project that Moshe did Torah Shebichtav and Rabbi Yehuda Nasi finished Torah Shebal Peh? Or are we able to say that no, we can continue Torah Shebal Peh into the Amoraim and into later generations?
A very creative reading, right? I guess sort of Anava being like a code word. Anava doesn't mean humility at all. It just means, Torah. It means completing Torah Shebal Peh, Torah Shebichtav, and continuing that project. Interesting. I haven't seen that shot. I think the challenge would be getting from Anava to Torah, meaning usually we assume those are two separable things, right? One can teach Torah and be humble, more humble, less humble. One can be humble and teach more or less Torah. So why would it use that term? But it's an interesting intertextual connection there that you're reading. We'll see some of the other answers here. We'll see that redefine humility also talk about Moshe. So Moshe is certainly a relevant figure. I think there's one more maybe approach, one more approach that rereads the Gemara in a sense, or has a different angle, sort of a twist that allows Rav Yosef to say that that he somehow proves humility. Liz.
So the Mirameh Sada, who we looked up and we're pretty sure it's the Netziv, says that there's a difference between like anava, meaning humility, and shvelut halev, meaning like low self-esteem. That what it's talking about is not sort of seeing yourself as not worthy of something or being the kind of person who would never say like stepping up, but the way that Rav Yosef behaves with other people is not with sort of pride or haughtiness. So you can in fact be the kind of person who is humble and respectful and doesn't put yourself above other people, and also name the fact that you're humble.
Okay, great. I think I'm going to hold off on getting into more detail on that, just because that's one of the redefinitions of humility. But yeah, that's definitely one of the great answers here. But we'll return to it momentarily. So can anyone point to another answer that doesn't redefine humility, but does somehow reread our Gemara? Erwin.
Yeah, we have the Tzibah HaKohen. I think you're referring to that one. That has an interesting twist that he says that, on the contrary, he didn't think that he was very humble. He thought he was not worthy of any praise, and people were praising him. So the reason that he was pointing to himself is that he was an example that if people are already praising him, it means that the generation must be consisting of very humble people.
Right. Okay. Great. Yeah. So source number 9 on the sheet, and he's quoting his father's interpretation. He says, "Be'emes Rav Yosef Ra shecholken kavod harbe." He saw he was getting a lot of honor. We have a Gemara in Pesachim that tells us that people used to say like, oh, if not for me, there'd be no Yosefs. Yosef sort of became the term for a great rabbi because of Rav Yosef. So he got a lot of honor. And Ach Rav Yosef migodol anva sanuso shehichzik es atzmo shehu eno roi klal lechavod. Right, as Erwin said, Rav Yosef thought he was nothing special. So why are all these people giving me honor? Must be everyone else is really humble. Why? Because they're giving me honor. So they must be, they're sort of, they're saying, oh, I'm less than Rav Yosef. I'm giving him deference and honor. Well, that means they, and Rav Yosef thinks they're essentially even levels. So they must be that they, they have a lower view of themselves than they should. And that's humility. That seems to be the reading here, right? So precisely, Rav Yosef says, Di'ika anna, there's me. What does me mean? It doesn't mean I'm humble. It means I, despite being nothing special, get all this honor from people because they have lower, sort of lower their own self-worth or they're humble in that way, however exactly you're going to define that. And they therefore give me honor. I prove that everyone else is humble. I'm the perfect case to prove that everyone else is humble. So it's similar in some ways to the Spas Emes, that it's not talking about him, it's talking about everyone else. But the word ana is actually different. It doesn't mean my generation. It means me as the object of humility rather than the person actually being humble, right? People are being humble at me. That's what ana means. So a very creative reading by this sefer as well. So and so what do we have so far, right? We have ana doesn't mean me. It means Mr. Ana. We have we have the view that it's not about Rav Yosef, it's about Rav Yosef's generation. And that could be either like the Sfas Emes, that the whole Mishnah is talking about generations rather than people, or it could be like the Vitziva Kohen says, that he is treated well by others must be because they themselves are humble. Now, before we jump into Liz's approach and another approach to redefine humility, there's one final approach that does neither of those. That's source number 4, the Maharsha. Someone want to give me the 2-second version of the Maharsha? Maybe 5 seconds. Any Maharsha takes? Yaakov, sorry, I didn't see you there.
Yeah, so it just says that, right, normally the Chachamim don't really speak this way about themselves, but when it comes to fixing like a mistake in Breita, they kind of have to, like, just correct the error.
Yeah, great. Right, so this is, I call the bite the bullet shot. Right, so he says, right, rabbis, certainly humble rabbis, it's not proper to to recount your praises. Let others praise you. You shouldn't praise yourself. Mikol makom kadesha lo yehe shone habraisa bitaos amru kain delo batla mishemes Rabbi. You can't have Torah be false. You can't have a teaching be incorrect. So he bit the bullet, right? He was willing to be not humble by saying, look at me, I'm humble, in order to make sure that we don't have a Mishnah that's false. And obviously, you can raise all sorts of questions about, how honest are we with ourselves? Isn't there a pitfall of someone always saying, Torah will be perverted if I don't praise myself publicly? Isn't that a dangerous approach to take? Sure, those are all valid questions. But for the Maharsha, at the end of the day, we have 2 values. We have the value of humility. We have the value of truth. And in this case, the value of truth and Torah being true wins out. And one needs to say, Rabbi Yosef felt the need to say, I am humble, in order to correct the Mishnah. Okay, so those are 4 different approaches that all sort of work on the margins. I mean, the Maharsha is maybe the clearest, right? He says this is not humble, and he did it anyway. The other approaches sort of avoid the challenge. But then there's two approaches here in the sources that redefine what humility is. So Liz helpfully pointed us to one of those. Source number 5, the Meromei Sadeh, where he draws a contrast. He says, Anava ena shiflus halev. Humility doesn't mean like having low self-esteem. That's how I'm translating that. Ella hanhaga bein bnei adam shelo begasus. But interacting with other people without coarseness or rudeness. So something like that. So people who aren't humble insult other people, are rude to them, don't take them seriously. People who are humble or who have anava, and this is again not our standard definition of humility, a little bit different. It's mostly about treating other people well, right? So that's at least one redefinition of humility here, and right, and that's why behind the Amr of Yosef Shayim Isnai Ke'echa Min Talmidim. He quotes the Gemara in Horios that Rav Yosef would treat himself like one of the students, right? So this is sort of the bridge, that bridge between humility and treating other people well, which is, if you're a great Torah scholar, you're the Rosh Yeshiva, whatever it is, you might walk around like with airs and say, look, I'm Rav Yosef, and not treat other people well. But if you sort of treat yourself, you look at yourself, present yourself like one of the people, like anyone else, not putting on airs, not mistreating others, so that's humility. But it's not primarily about self-perception, it's primarily about how one relates to others. Interesting. Yeah, so I see Liz, you asked, is this also a dig at the Musar movement? Very interesting, right? Because he explicitly says, below Mesilas Yesharim, not like the Mesilas Yesharim, the I am nothing approach. And we can go tell all the jokes about, who do you think you are to be nothing. We're gonna just telegraph that. But right, so it could very well be. It seems like that makes sense given the Meromei Sadeh's pedigree and what's going on at the time and his invocation of the Mesilas Yesharim here, probably, right? But this is a view, I'd say famously Lithuanian Talmudists have a reputation of not being overly humble, not saying I am nothing, I'm nothing, and that's maybe part of this, right? It's about treating other people well rather than having a false sense of low self-esteem or something like that. So that's the Meromei Sadeh's approach. Reinterpret humility. Humility doesn't mean that you can't say, I'm humble if you actually are humble. Humility is about treating other people well. So there's no real contradiction here. Does someone want to point to the other approach in these sources that redefines humility, or maybe even their own, if they want? Shira R.
Just that like self-awareness and humility are not mutually exclusive. And that was the, I can't have this Zoom open and the page open at the same time, but yeah, that was one of them.
And just can you say a bit more about self-awareness and humility, how that?
Meaning like you can, like there's like a tzaddik that like recognizes his level, like you know kind of where you are, and like even if you don't walk around touting that, like that doesn't contradict the fact that like you are humble. Like you still need to know where you are in order to like be something.
Okay. Great, right? So you can be honest about what you're, where you're at, what your spiritual level is, so to speak, without that impeding your humility. Great, and that's source number 7, the Avnei Nezer, and we'll just read part of that. It says, "Amnam ein hayadim mikol ele." So Seres ha'anava b'shivron leiv klal. He's talking about someone who knows themselves to have whatever qualities. He's saying that knowledge of your own great qualities doesn't contradict humility or even shivron leiv, right? Even brokenness of heart, which is a little surprising. You might think to distinguish between those two, but he says no. It's a problem for neither. Umoshe Rabbeinu Olav Shalom Yada Mikol Masha Asa Nisim, and it flows V'Kibel Torah Milabos Eish. Right. For example, oh wow, my visuals are giving some trouble here, but bear with me. I think I'm still here. So he says that Moshe was also a great person. He did all these miracles. That's pretty clear throughout the Torah, and yet that never stopped him from saying V'lokam Navi Obi Yisrael Moshe, from writing in the Torah. Moshe, there was no Navi like Moshe, and of course the Torah also says that Moshe was Anav Mikol Ha'adam. Moshe was the most humble. There's no contradiction between saying someone like Moshe did all these miracles and was humble and was the most humble, and there's no contradiction there. Why? Because the point is, as Shira told us, if you're actually humble, you can honestly say, I am the best at X and Y, right? And that wouldn't affect you. Meaning, gaiva, pride, is when saying things that are actually true somehow give you this inflated sense of self that's inaccurate, that makes you feel like you deserve, or you are more than you should be. You are more than you actually are. And he says, every person has their own status, has their own level that they've achieved. You have to be honest with yourself about your level and not inflate it. But if you're being honest, assuming that's not getting to your head, that can still be anava. And that's why he says, Rav Yosef himself said, Ilav hayom the kagars kama Yosef ikabashuga, right? Again, apparently was this line that he used, but it was also common that, how many Yosefs would be out there? How many great Talmidei Chachamim like me would there be out there? But he also says, Lotisni anava di'ikana, he says he's the most humble person. He says that he's a great Talmid Chacham, and there's no contradiction there. He says, that he admits it does take a little bit of work to figure out how this all shakes out, right? It's still not fully clear how someone can be humble and great, and say they're humble and say they're great, and those all can coexist, but he thinks they can. Humility is about having an honest self-assessment, not about saying you're less than you are or putting yourself down. And then he ends, some, there's some tzaddikim are more humble than others. Some tzaddikim have a better self-awareness of their spiritual level than others. Rav Yosef happened to be very self-aware, others less so, but there's no contradiction between saying I'm humble and being humble, or even saying I'm great and being humble, assuming you're being honest and it's not getting to you. So I think there's a lot to think about here. I know there's, between the Musar movement and, I think even some contemporary literature outside of Jewish tradition about, we shouldn't deny our own self-worth. There's a lot, there's much broader discussions to be held here. We're not going to get into all of those, but I think this is helpful that we have, aside from the classic, old school model, you could call it, that humility means putting yourself down, thinking you're less than you should be, which we saw implicit in some of the commentaries. We have two alternatives here. We have the Meromei Sadeh, that it's about treating other people well and not putting them down. And we have the Avnei Nezer here, that it's about an honest self-assessment. And that's what humility is. And again, it's not simple, and the cases don't work out so easily, as the Avnei Nezer himself says, but these are various approaches to humility that are worth thinking about or worth reflecting on, and I think many have, and it's a worthwhile discussion. Before we go forward, I just wanted to open it up. Did anyone have other answers, other approaches that weren't in the sources per se? And I think we heard one earlier about the connection to Moshe. Wanted to write from Tvir. I wanted to open it up if anyone has other additional perspectives. Rami.
I mean, this goes back to what you were talking about earlier about irony, but is it possible that the Gemara is actually putting this out there to be like, to prove its point, being like, look, like humility really did die when Rabbi died, because look at this guy saying how humble he is. Like, sort of there's an ironic thing going on.
So humility might have died, but irony didn't, or humor didn't. Okay, interesting. I guess the challenge with that reading is, first of all, the Gemara sounds very sincere, right? Or Yosef's like, I object to Ikana, but also, like, if Rav Yosef was the one who wanted to, like, if you were right, it would be like someone else would be like, hey, look at this. Rav Yosef says he thinks he's humble. Isn't that funny? There's obviously no more humility, right? But like, if it's Rav Yosef saying it himself, it's a little harder. You don't have that, I don't know if you call it comic distance or whatever, for that to really work as well. But definitely an interesting reading. I think some people say, oh, it's a joke. But again, it doesn't read like a joke. It reads like an objection. You know, just because we read it like a joke, we want to impose that on the text. But it's, you know, it's not, I would resist that unless you have a clear indicator or something that would point to that. But yeah, definitely an interesting way of taking it. People also say, like, Talmidei Chachamim Marbim Shalom Ba'olam, right, that's a joke. But like, I don't think the people who said it thought it was a joke. Like, you might think it's a joke, but, you know, yeah, other suggestions, other ideas. Talia.
I think to support what Rami said, I'm really interested in the fact that the Gemara preserves this conversation, which I think is like, they could have just said, oh, sorry, Rav Nachman, sorry, Rav Yosef, you're totally right. We got confused when we were trying to repeat this Mishnah, and we're just going to take it out. But I think by preserving both opinions and the conversation, they're saying, no, like, no, they were wrong. They just had this like funny thing that they wanted to say, and yeah.
Interesting, right? So you're going with the view of who was it? The what you call it? The Sfas Emes, it was, right? Yeah, the Sfas Emes, right? That by keeping in the Mishnah and keeping in this discussion, Rabbi Yosef and Rav Nachman seem to clearly be wrong, and it's worth preserving that teaching to see their view, but they're wrong, and we're sort of preserving that, right? Yeah, that's interesting. You definitely, I mean, that is just how the Sfas Emes reads it. You could also read it a different way, that maybe they're right, like they sort of get the last word, right? So the Mishnah, maybe they thought the Mishnah was true, but now we have the Gemara to update us, to fill us in, and I mean, you could take it either way. That, you know, part of the question is then why don't you edit the Mishnah? And that's the whole question. Like, how much were the Amoraim editing Mishnayos? Is that what they're supposed to be doing, or they just like comment on it? There's like a whole massive literature on that. So that's, you know, that's all a fair question. But yeah, definitely an interesting way of looking at it. Zoe.
It seems like, though, this is fundamentally reflecting like that none of us know exactly what humility is. And I think this is true of many midot. I think we don't often know exactly what the midah is, but we say chesed is good. I think humility, we're told, is good. Like this is diaraita good, because we know Moses was the most humble of men, like Hashem says that. But now, like, is that sort of self-deprecating and putting yourself down, or is that something worthy? Like, can I say I'm the most humble person? Is that even a valid statement? So I think we're questioning like the entire, I think the fact that we have so many diverse answers shows what a difficult concept this is fundamentally.
Totally, yeah, that's a great sort of meta note on this sugya. Yeah. Any other thoughts, reflections, answers? Jessica.
This might be a bit of a stretch, but it feels like the placement of this is the very end of the Masechet is interesting, because we've just been talking, the whole Masechet is about rituals that we no longer do. And there's a kind of question, especially when it comes to something like Sutta, more so than Egla Arufa maybe, of like, you know, is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? And it feels like this kind of like line in the Mishnah of, you know, ending on this note of sort of, you know, really sort of like Yerida Hadara, like the going down of the generations and things becoming worse. It feels like kind of this line is potentially pushing back on that, saying, no, actually, we late Amoraim are doing pretty well. It's not as bad as all that. We've actually got a good setup, and you could read it as like, and I think the placement is definitely making you question whether it is a comment on something more general about the potentially even like the Judaism of the late Amoraim as opposed to the Judaism of the temple periods.
Okay, yeah, great. I like that direction a lot. I may take a stab at developing at least one angle on that in a couple minutes. So great, thank you. Yeah, thank you for suggesting that. I think that very well could be what's going on. Okay, Micah.
I'd like to suggest we read this as a kind of a challenge from Chazal, particularly based, like Jessica, like you were saying, on its position at the end of this Masechet. We focused, last week we talked about some of the one of the themes of the Masechet being a kind of a difficulty we feel in galut and gullus in terms of being able to like have coherent justice to measure precisely, and Sota and Egla Arufa both being sort of things we don't actually have access to anymore, as is sort of this whole list, this whole final Mishnah that brings us to sort of the peak kind of corruption of character of our priest and king. We mourn, I don't know, this, I think, and mourn this like list of venerable characteristics that we wish we saw more of in society. It could be a pretty dark note to leave off a Masechet. And in that context, I think the kashas or the objections prove to us that I think I'm mostly reading in line with Maharsha, though also the Netziv, that there's a need for us to say, wait, we still have midos, even we still have the capacity to cultivate midos, and through doing so, to like we still have yeshivas in Babylon and Bavel and the Hadran Alach. And we're going to continue to learn and cultivate midos through that, despite the fact that we have a lot to mourn and a lot that we can't be involved in anymore.
All right, great. Very nice analysis of, right, again, like a hopeful direction by the Amoraim there along Jessica's lines. Great. Any other thoughts? Okay, so yeah, as I said, I wanted to develop a line of thought maybe in a similar direction to Jessica and Micah. I think I'm thinking of this a bit less in the context of Maseches Sota, although it certainly connects overall, but more in the context of our Mishnah, of the specific Mishnah, where we saw it started with a discussion of the destruction of the temple, and then it moved on to the passing of various rabbis and the loss and sort of the responses to that, where it's right to cancel various forms of celebration, to cancel Greek culture on the one hand, and on the other hand, the loss of the rabbis led to just loss of different character traits. So I think it may help us if we look at another Gemara that talks about the destruction of the temple and the cessation of sacrifice in a different way that also will come back to our themes of Anava and Yiras, of humility and fear of sin. And to that end, let's take a look at source number 10. Sources, well, really 10 and 11, the Gemara in Gittin is traditionally studied on Tisha B'Av about the destruction of the Mikdash. And 10 is the opening line. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Mai dichsiv, Ashrei adam mefachei tamid u'mak shelibo yipol b'ra. What does it mean? A person, happy is the person who always fears. One who hardens their heart will fall in bad. And he says it's based on all these stories. It's referring to all these stories we're about to see in the Gemara. Kamsu bar Kamsa, Charav Yerushalayim, the story of Kamsu bar Kamsa. Tarnagol Charav Tur Malka, the destruction of Har HaMelech, based on a story involving chickens, and Saga the Rivsak, the Rispak, Charav Beitar, and the destruction of Beitar, based on a bag of feet. So there's a whole long discussion. It's multiple dapim of Gemara. If you have downtime next Thursday, when you're not doing the Drisha program, you're all very much invited to study this Gemara. But for our purposes, it's interesting that it's all framed as the destruction of the Mikdash and Yerushalayim is all framed as based on one who fears, somehow fearing God is the framing there. Being a fear, I think Rashi there, if I recall, says one who fears God. And well, let's focus on one piece of the story, source number 11. This is partway through the Bar Kamsa story. Bar Kamsa insults Kamsa. Kamsa is very upset. He decides he wants to do in not just the immediate people who did him trouble, but also the rabbis and really the whole Jewish people. Azal Amr Le Caesar. So Kamsa goes to the Caesar. He says, Mardu Bach Yehudai, the Jews are rebelling. Amr Le Miyimar, who said? Amr Le Shadar Lu Karbana Chazis Imakrabin Le. Well, why don't you bring them, do a test, bring them a carbon, see if they're willing to offer it. Azal Shadar Biyade Egla Tilsi, he gave a third calf, whatever a third calf means. Apparently it's fancy calf. Behade the Kasi Shadar Beimuma Beniv Sfasaim. As it was going to the Mikdash, as they were bringing it to the temple, so Kamsa put a little cut on its lip, or a cut on its eye, something that would be hard to notice. And also, something that for Jews, for halacha, is a mum, but within Greco-Roman sacrifice wasn't the problem. So it wouldn't be understandable to the Caesar why you would cancel this offering just because there's a little cut on its lip or a cut on its eye. Exactly how that works is a whole discussion. We don't need to get into that now. So what do you do, right? You're the rabbis. You get this calf from the emperor. You're supposed to bring it but it has a mum, so you're not supposed to bring it. So what do you do? The rabbis said, let's bring it because we want peace with the king. We don't want to have a war here. His response was, Yomru, Bali Mumin Craven Legabim Mizbeach. If we offer this, people will think you can just bring an animal with a mum. Mums don't matter. So you can't, even if technically we could override the halacha of not bringing a carbon with a mum in order to preserve peace, we still have a further consideration of the worry that people will think that you can bring animals with a blemish. Sovereign Lamictale. So they said, okay, let's kill Kamsa so that he won't be able to tell the emperor what happened. We won't have anyone to report back. Well, if we kill, this is the worry of Zuckier ben Akkulos. If we kill Kamsa, he's not worried about the government being upset or something like that. He's worried that people will think that if you put a blemish on a sacrifice, you get killed. That's the proper punishment, and they'll think the wrong thing. Amr Yochanan anvas sanuso shel Rabbi Zuckier ben Akkulos hechriva es beitenu v'sarfa es hechalenu higlisanu me'artzenu. This anvasanus, which is sort of a fancy word for anava, this humility, improper humility of Rabbi Zuckier ben Akkulos, by him rejecting, he's saying not to offer the animal and not to kill Kamsa, that destroyed our house, destroyed the temple, burnt the Heichal, the inner part of the Mikdash, and led to our exile. So our downfall is a function of anvisanus, of anava, of humility. There's a whole massive discussion I could have given, just like there were like 8 readings or 6 readings, whatever it was, on how how Rabbi Yosef could talk about anava. There's probably an equal number of readings of how what Rabbi Zuckier ben Akkulos did is humility. What does it have to do with humility? Right? Him saying, don't bring the offering because it has a mum, and don't kill Kamsa because people will think the wrong thing halachically. How is that humility? It's very odd. So we're not going to go into all those answers, but here's one approach from actually Rav Chaim Kanievsky, which my Shiur knows is our hero because he wrote an entire sefer on Perek Egla Arufa. But also, this is a separate Dvar Torah he has on the Gemara and Gittin that got published here in the Daf al Daf book, which is on Bar Ilan. So we have access through here. And he says to understand this, you need to look at a Tosefta in Shabbos. In terms of muktzah laws, if you have shells or bones after you ate food, is that muktzah or not? Beis Shammai says it's muktzah. Beis Hillel says you can remove it from the table. Zuckier ben Akkulos look at Beis Shammai, look at Beis Hillel. He would do neither. He would sort of put it behind the bed, maybe indirectly, not wanting to risk doing something that's muktzah. Amar Rabbi Yossi, Anva Sanusel Rabbi Zuckier ben Akkulos sarfa as a heichal. And then we invoke the same line from our Gemara. Really weird. Oh, well, that's that anava, that humility, that destroyed our temple. So again, first of all, like, why is it so bad? We'll answer that another time. But why is this humility? What's the humility here? And so he explains. So Rav Chaim Kanievsky explains. What's the relationship between these two Gemaras? They're both about anvisanus. The answer is and interesting coming from Rav Chaim Kanievsky, who's fairly big machmir, but he says you don't always need to be machmir, you don't always need to be stringent. Sometimes people are stringent from a place of improper humility. What do I know? I can't decide this halacha. I'll just say be machmir. I don't want to take the risk of deciding halacha here. I don't know enough. I'm too humble, so I'll be machmir. And he says, of course, we'd never accuse Rabbi Zuckier of himself falling into this trap, but it happens sometimes. And I think that's presumably how he's reading this Gemara. So he did fall into the trap, right? But so there's a bridge here. There's a connection here between humility and yiras chet and fear of sin, right? Just like in our Gemara, Rabbi was both humble and fearful of sin. The Gemara in Gittin also talks about on Vasanus, talks about humility, but there is a sort of humility that connects to fear of sin. The two actually relate to one another. And of course, that's what the Gemara's whole framing is, right? You need to have the right amount of mifachet tamid, the right amount of fear of God, fear of sin. That's what's important. If you have the wrong balance of that, bad things will happen. Zuckier ben Avkulos had a little too much on Vasanus, had a little too much fear of sin, a little too little self-assurance that he could rule leniently in various cases, and that was his downfall. So I think this connects between the two qualities of Rebbe, which is important. But I think also this puts the broader issue in a new perspective. It casts it in a new light. Because if we think about it, Rebbe, of course, represents Chazal maybe more than anyone else, and he was the prototypical Yirei Chet and Anav, right? He was the most humble, he was the most fearing of sin. If we think about what happens with the Churban, with the destruction of the temple, you have Greco-Roman armies and Greco-Roman culture overtaking the Jewish culture, in a sense. You have the destruction of the Mikdash, the ending of sacrifice, right? If sacrifice, if it's not culture, it's cultus, it's definitely some form of culture, it's religious culture, and that was ended in two different Gemaras in two different ways, right? Either by sending the pig or by sending the Baal Mum. And if you follow the rules, you end up in trouble. The whole system gets exploded. And maybe there's some ways that it's right to not bring the carbon when it has a mum, sometimes when you should bring it anyway. But that's the tension. That's the fight. The fight is between Greco-Roman culture with their power and trying to enforce a certain vision on Jewish culture, and on the other hand, the Jews trying to stand up for what they believe in, trying to stand up for their karbanos, and also trying to stand up for all of their qualities. And I think, building on what Jessica and Micah said, I think in the Mishnah, we see there's not only a decline in the destruction of the Mikdash that leads to all these xeros, that leads to all these different ways of decreasing happiness that we mark this time of year, but there's also a decline in the midos, in the different personal qualities of all these rabbis. And it's not a coincidence that this all happens now. It all happens right around and after the destruction of the temple, when Greco-Roman culture is being imposed, as it were, over Jewish culture. And the crescendo of that is Anava and yiras chet are lost. And again, those may be the greatest, in some ways, the greatest of the Jewish qualities, the idea of fearing sin or following halacha overall, right? Of following a hard set of rules and doing so with anava, maybe humility not only towards other people, but towards God, of being able to say God is great and above, and I'm a mere anav. And to think of it in that way, those are central Jewish qualities. I included a piece from Matthew Arnold's Hebraism and Hellenism for a couple of reasons. It is a little old-fashioned and maybe a little overgeneralizing, but first of all, my Rebbe, Rav Lichtenstein, used to quote this article, so always want to keep the Masorah going. And it's at the very least, a helpful shortcut or heuristic to some of the differences between Jewish and Hellenic culture. And just to select a few lines from that piece, from source 13, he says in his view, both Hellenism and Hebraism are spiritual disciplines. They aim at man's perfection, but they do so in very different ways. He says the uppermost idea with Hellenism is to see things as they really are. Presumably that's the idea of the ideas, and everything should aspire for its purpose and its telos. And the uppermost idea with Hebraism is conduct and obedience. If I had to say conduct and obedience in Hebrew, I might say anava v'yiras chet, humility towards God and fear of sin as a result. Whereas Greek culture is about presenting things in their greatest form, having things represent flourishing, the human body, the Olympics, wisdom, philosophy. It's not about meekness towards some other power. It's about building up humans as much as possible for a sense of flourishing. And that's why he says they both Hellenism and Hebraism, they both have a quarrel with physicality. The Greek quarrel is that they hinder right thinking. Right? So you want to optimize your body only to the extent it doesn't stop you from optimizing your thinking. The Hebrew quarrel with them is that they hinder right acting. It's about action. It's about halacha. It's about following the proper law. It's about yiras chet. And again, the governing idea of Hellenism is spontaneity of consciousness. That of Hebraism, strictness of conscience. Strictness of conscience, I might translate anvisanus. Right? That's Zuckier maybe took it too far. Rabbi had the right balance. Rabbi was the perfect anav and the perfect yirei chet. And I think what our Gemara is doing is it's looking at the Mishnah. The Mishnah points to a period of massive decline. Decline in the loss of mikdash, decline in the loss of culture. As those remnants of the Jewish culture, when they actually controlled their own destiny, were slowly being lost. As different rabbis, different chachamim were passing away, there is a real fear, there's a real worry that this is the end. That this is the end of Jewish culture overall. And the Gemara, by objecting in these cases and in others and saying, wait, di'ika ana, there still are some people out there who are living these values. And it doesn't mean that Rav Yosef was the greatest anav ever. And it's not really about Rav Yosef. It's not about himself. It's about the broader Jewish culture still being preserved in a world without a temple, a world without a mikdash, a world where Jewish culture is being overwhelmed by the ambient culture, by the Greco-Roman culture that controlled the area. And so I think maybe we can read this, the end of humility and the rebirth of humility, the reclaiming of humility by Rav Yosef, and the reclaiming of yiras chet by Rav Nachman is a way of saying we are preserving our Jewish culture. We're doing what we can to preserve a halachic culture, to preserve a modus vivendi, a way of life, even amidst these crises. And while we're mourning for the mikdash, and there are all these gzeros, and there's all these things that we lack, we actually, the way to move forward is to take stock of what we have, to believe in our own culture, and of course, not to the exclusion of taking positive things where they lie, but to double down really on Jewish culture, on, at least for these purposes, on Nava and Yiras Chet, among other values, and to build forward to hopefully be in a place where there can be a broader restoration, and that would be, the full response to the Mishnah would be the restoration not only of these personal qualities, but also of the Beis HaMikdash itself. So I guess we may have a minute or two for questions now, if people have them. Happy to take questions, other views, disputes, but that's at least one reading, I think, of this Gemara. And if I don't see your hand, just call out, because it's hard to monitor a lot of people. If not, that's also okay. Shira?
Yeah. I mean, it's more of like a thought than anything else, but just like the idea that we were saying in the Avnei Nezer about how like Anava is about sense of self, I think like you can also kind of read that into the second Gemara of like he had like overly was like involved in like his sense of self and like his own internal like concept of halacha and like not thinking in the broad. And I think like in that way Anava was also the downfall.
Interesting. So too much, if Anava means having a sense of self, too much Anava means thinking too much about your own strictures, your own categories, instead of thinking about the klal. Interesting reading. Nice. Okay, last call.
I think that also a kind of cool thing is about we take the anavut of later of the story of Bar Kamsa, but if we go earlier into the story of Bar Kamsa, I think there's a parallel to the idea of Egla Arufa of how the community didn't think about, or even with like the death of Bar Kamsa, one person's death and one person's life and embarrassing one person within your community is enough to have unraveled the destruction of the entire community. And how like there's every individual within the community is interwoven in our accountability for their well-being.
For sure. Yeah, that's another important theme. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, if there's no other comments.
Thank you, and Yasher Koach, for a really wonderful shiur.
Okay.
Thanks, Shlomo.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.